Hi everyone, welcome to GoLocal Live. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in this Wednesday afternoon here in downtown Providence. I'd like to welcome someone who came up from Newport. Walter Berbrick with the U.S. Naval War College. Thank you for coming in today. Associate Professor of the War Gaming Department, Director of the Arctic Studies Group, Area Study Coordinator for Global Climate Security. How did you get into this line of work?
Good question, right? I always get that question, how does a guy from born and raised in South Florida get in the line of getting the work of Arctic issues? And it's funny because today's National Maritime Day. And so how fitting is it to actually talk about Arctic and maritime issues? And it's a day, right, to what we pay tribute to the men and women over the course of history who have served in the U.S. Merchant Marine. And so, and for me, it kind of goes back into history, and it all stems really from my grandfather.
Okay.
And he, the day after Pearl Harbor, he signed up for duty in Nimitz's Navy as a cook and sailed throughout the Pacific. Back home, my grandmother, one of 14 children, served as a switchboard telephone operator. And then after the war, they started a family, saved their money, and opened up a small neighborhood restaurant, right? And so growing up in that industry, and he was not only in the business of serving up a great dining experience, but he was in the business of bringing people and communities together. So where the elite meet to eat was his slogan.
Okay.
Because in his eyes, he thought everyone deserved the chance to live up to his or her God-given potential. So growing up in that industry and growing up in the service industry, I had a new appreciation for that. And throughout high school, I thought I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to study sports medicine and become a strength and conditioning coach for a team. And 9/11 hit. And then so that fundamentally changed and sparked really a lifetime of public service. And so finished up my degree and enlisted in the Navy, and then became an intel officer, and then found my way to the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island in 2009. And that's really where it all began in terms of Arctic affairs. Okay. But that was the journey through there. And it was at the time the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Roughhead, was testifying on the Hill, and he was prepping for a testimony and wanted to better understand the strategic security implications as a result of an opening Arctic. And so he asked the War Gaming Department to lead an effort, and so we did that. And then about a year later, we launched another game. In this case, it was for U.S. Fleet Forces Command, who's responsible for organized training and equipping the Navy, and we specifically looked at capability gaps. And so as I sat in my class in my senior year and I was watching the towers fall, I got this pit in my stomach, right? How, why would somebody do this, and how could the world's most powerful country be so vulnerable?
And that switched your career.
And so that same feeling came over me after we led the analytic efforts for this game, for this Fleet Arctic Operations game, where there was enormous amounts of capability gaps. And I thought, how could the world's most powerful Navy be so vulnerable? And so from that point forward, we launched. I stayed in that area, pursued my studies in that area, and then back at the War College, we launched an Arctic Studies Group, so one of 7 regional studies groups that we have at the college. And then we created a series of electives, and then this past year rolled out our new area of study, where we look at global climate security in the Arctic. And so that's...
What is going on in the Arctic right now? What are you seeing?
Great question.
And we just talked a little bit before you came on from your last trip there. What are we seeing in the Arctic?
So we are seeing a northern region that is melting twice or warming twice the rate as anywhere else in the world. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change identified 2 things, 2 key areas. One is the planet is warming, and the Arctic is warming twice the rate than anywhere, almost 3 times the rate as anywhere else in the world. And the other thing that they recognized is that there's the melting and the warming is as a result of more greenhouse CO2 emissions. And so here at the college, we don't necessarily focus on the causes, we focus on the effects.
You focus on the implications, because I think folks might want to know too, what's the U.S.'s interest in the Arctic?
And so what we're seeing, right, is a rapidly melting polar ice cap, the shortest maritime trade route linking Asia, Europe, and North America. So you would circumvent the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal, where you now have a new maritime trade route. You have an increased abundance and distribution of fish and minerals. So there's a couple good studies that have been done looking at fish migration. And if you look at that, there's supposed to be about 40 new species that are supposed to emerge in the northern region, with quite a bit focused along the Bering Strait region in between the U.S. and Russia, and some along Denmark and Canada. And so we should expect to see more fishing and potentially more illegal fishing. And we also see, right, the historically intense relationship between NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Russia. And today we see the historical rise and influence of China's third ocean strategy. And so these are some of the big muscle movements, some of the big factors that are taking shape in the region today. And we, as an Arctic nation, have a fundamental interest in the region. And if it wasn't for the foresight and courage of one Secretary of State Seward, the United States wouldn't be an Arctic nation, and we probably likely wouldn't be having this conversation. And so over 150 years ago, we purchased Alaska from Russia for a whopping $7 million.
$7 million.
So probably one of the best investments that our country has ever made. And that's how we became an Arctic nation. And there's a whole history there through the interwar years and through World War II, through the Cold War, and even today. And we as an Arctic nation have we have an interest as a provider of peace and as an architect of new security arrangements, as a strong proponent of economic growth, as a advocate and promoter for the indigenous peoples, as a steward of the environment, really, and as a builder and leader of coalitions to deal with really the changes of a rapidly changing ice-free Arctic world.
So what are the challenges now, as you mentioned, again, warming at that rate twice as much as being seen around the world? Again, the geopolitics, if you will, of what's taking place with, again, that melting taking place there as well. What are the challenges facing this country? You talked a little bit about, again, seeing emerging species, talking about trade routes, but, things are always interconnected. So, so what are the challenges now moving forward for the U.S.?
So we see a number of transnational threats or challenges. One being, environmental degradation as a result of a warming climate and coastal erosion. We see the release of infectious diseases as a result of a melting permafrost. We see the displacement of people and mammals. So we see a number of different issues in addition to the kind of the big geopolitical issues. But I think one of the key things to think about, right, is some in Washington and elsewhere believe that promoting democracy isn't necessarily isn't necessarily a practical foreign policy, or potentially even in the interest of the United States. And so historically, we've always felt that the health of our people and our economy is very much dependent on the health and economies of other nations as well. And so that's a key factor that we can't lose sight of. The second, I think, emerging challenge that we're seeing, and that gets most of the press and media attention, is that for the first time since the end of the Cold War, we see a more assertive and aggressive Russia on the world stage. And with a country who owns half of the Arctic, and whose northern coastline is in half the Arctic, they have fundamental interest. And so, and they're growing their capabilities and their influence from a military perspective, but Moscow in particular is very interested in developing the Northern Sea route for shipping, but also tapping into the vast amounts of natural gases and oil deposits that are there, and protecting both from state and non-state actors. And so Russia's very keen, and there's lots going on in their backyard, our backyard. And I would say the third biggest challenge that we face, and I think the most significant challenge to American interest in the Arctic, is the rise and influence of China, and whose interests and values differ dramatically from ours. And so the Chinese Communist Party has developed a white paper, a policy that outlines their interest and their position, and is interested in developing the space in terms of governance. We've also seen them, they've been They're now a member or an observer in the Arctic Council, which is the primary intergovernmental organization that comes up with some of the norms and agreements in regional agreements. And we've also seen them spearhead the Arctic Circle Assembly, which is the largest gathering of leaders from across the world on Arctic issues. And so China's doing quite a bit in the region economically. They see it as a way to extend their One Belt, One Road initiative. And there's, possibly we could see, some debt trap lending as that we normally see with the One Belt, One Road initiative. The other thing is we've seen, China unsuccessfully build and maintain or build, fund, and invest in seaports and airports in the Arctic, and especially in Greenland. And Greenland is a significant place for the Arctic and for U.S. interest in the Arctic, historically through our military presence, but I think there's a growing economic interest and scientific interest in there as well.
So all of these factors, and with your studies and looking at what's taking place in the Arctic, what's coming out of the Naval War College, what should people watching know what should the U.S. be doing now moving forward?
We have to, since the end of the Cold War, we think about, what has emerged is our thinking of regions as Asia, Europe, North America, but really they converge in the Arctic. So it merits a rethinking of how we look at the region as this new emerging region. So I think that demands organizationally, our national security institutions need to change, and we need to think about positioning people in leadership positions within the White House, Pentagon, the State Department, across our government, to think about the Arctic and to give it the attention it deserves. And I think one good place to start is at the White House with the White House Arctic Executive Steering Committee that was launched in the previous administration. And that's something the last administration took a big leadership role in the region, having launched the national strategy and implementation plan. There was a DoD Arctic strategy, and the Navy and Coast Guard came out with their respective strategies as well. In fact, they just updated their strategies this week.
Those private or those public? Are those like classified documents?
Those are public, unclassified documents. Yeah. So anybody can go online and check it out. Google, Navy Strategic Outlook or U.S. Coast Guard Strategic Outlook, and you can see and read those firsthand.
Now you said being relatively new, I'm sure you've taken a look. Does it differ greatly than previous ones? Does it just tweak slightly? Did anything surprise you, or is it sort of on course from what we'd seen previously?
I think there's a fundamental shift in how both of the services view the changing and evolving security environment, and highlighting how the Arctic's place in this new era of great power competition, where multiple great powers are competing for access and influence, and something that hasn't historically happened at the level it's happening in the Arctic region. So when you're competing for access and influence for fish and minerals and new shipping routes and all of these opportunities, but it's also an opportunity for us as a region to come together and cooperate. And so that's at the Naval War College. We just launched. We were very fortunate enough to have Admiral Sonnes, a really good friend of mine, who was the former head of Navy and head of Coast Guard for Norway, come. And at the same time, I had just finished a year at the State Department working Arctic issues, and we kind of came together and launched this Newport Arctic Scholars Initiative. And it's kind of the first of its kind initiative that brings together sailors and scholars from across the region to focus on and study on sea power related questions to this new emerging region. So think about, we got a big brain, a scholar, and we paired them up with somebody who's has the real world practical experience, an operator, brought them together from each of the 8 Arctic countries. Unfortunately, due to policy restrictions, we couldn't bring in Russia, but we're working on that. And we came up with 39 principles of security, Arctic security, in the areas of awareness, confidence building measures, and capabilities. So all with an eye towards maintaining peace and stability. As this region opens up, we want to keep the tensions down, prevent miscalculations, and ensure that the Arctic Ocean remains an ocean of peace rather than a new theater of war.
Well, very fascinating, again, being here in Rhode Island with that look at how important the Arctic is in geopolitics and with the climate as well. So Walter Berbrick with the U.S. Naval War College, I appreciate your
Thank you so
taking
much.
the time
Appreciate
for
it.
coming in here today.
Grateful for the
And thank
opportunity.
you for watching. We're going to be back at 4 o'clock with more local news here in GoLocal Live. So we'll see you then. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.